Yeah, we should be set.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'll just go ahead then. Get into it, as they say. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of James's Interviews. This is episode 21, and I am joined with my guest, Dr. Josh Bowen. How are you doing today, Dr. Bowen?
Doing okay, doing okay. Did you have a nice Thanksgiving?
Yeah, I was about to ask the same thing. It was pretty good.
Good.
A lot of turkey, although I prefer Christmas ham or
Yes.
Thanksgiving ham, I guess, when it's on Thanksgiving. But yeah, it was pretty good. Spend time
Good.
with family, and yeah.
Excellent. Excellent.
So, it's funny because I was trying to do this with you for a while, and I'm not blaming you. I'm blaming myself more because like it
You could
was
blame
like
me. It's okay.
there was just so many things. It was like one thing after the other, and I was just like, I feel really bad. And then also, I was also thinking too. I was like, I because today's episode for everyone. Sorry, I should have started with this. Is on Dr. Bowen's book, did the Old Testament endorse slavery? And I was thinking, I'm like, he's probably sick of this topic by now. Uh, but I was just kind of laughing at myself because I know that this year you've been very busy. I've really enjoyed watching you with like Dr. Kipp,
Mhm.
addressing issues like the Canaanite conquest and having that discussion, that dialogue with Trent Horn and Gavin Ortlund on
Yeah.
slavery and related issues. And I know you've been also been on like rationality rules and deep drinks, talking about slavery in the Hebrew Bible. And the first question I wanted to ask you is, um, why did you write this book? And then also, if people haven't noticed, because this is a very expanded edition. So I guess why did you write this book? And then also why did you update this book as well?
Yeah, good questions. So I think when I initially came on to social media, particularly onto YouTube, I really thought that I was going to be engaging mostly about the ancient Near East and sort of utilizing that to one degree or another with, engaging with the Hebrew Bible. And it very quickly seemed to move to countering bad apologetics. And so one of the, sort of the standard things that you would expect to come out in apologetic arguments, things like the dating of the book of Daniel, or did Moses write the Pentateuch? These sorts of things were pretty common. But for some God-forsaken reason, slavery just kept cropping up. And I mean, incessantly.
Mm.
And it always, and it still does, really. It always took me back. Like, why in the world are people? I mean, they're defending, that's what they're doing. They're defending slavery. I don't understand.
Mm.
And so I ended up putting together a three-part video response to a content creator by the name of John McCrae. What do you meme is his YouTube name, I guess. And he was responding to Alex O'Connor, who was responding to Alan Parr on this topic of slavery. And I thought everybody got stuff wrong. Some people got stuff right more than others. Alex was pretty close in what he was saying. And so I said, I'm just gonna put a video together. And I ended up putting a three-part scripted series together. And so at the end of that, I had, I'm the kind of person that you might think I do it because of great intellectual integrity or something. And I guess there's some of that in there, but really it's out of fear. It's out of fear that my advisor from Hopkins is going to somehow like catch one of my streams and he's going to be like, Josh didn't do all this reading of the secondary literature on this. So I tend to go very thorough in my investigations. And so anyway, I had these very fairly thorough scripts into slavery in the Hebrew Bible, slavery in the ancient Near East. And I thought, you know what, I'll put a handy dandy little resource together. So it ended up being bibliography and everything ended up being like 200 pages maybe. And it was just sort of the like quick hits, basics. If you're arguing the topic of slavery in the Old Testament. Here you go. And it has never stopped. So I've said any number of times the apologetic arguments that I face, it's the style of throw it up against the wall and see what sticks apologetics, and never more so than in the topic of slavery, because people can there are just so many little nuances that you can try to grab hold of, and it just anyway. So over a couple of years, the book being published, after the book was published, more and more arguments came out. All the old standard ones sort of died off on, which was great. Um, but all these new ones crept up. And I got to the point where I said to Megan, you know, we just need to put a, like, I don't know, a final nail in the coffin style book on this out. And so what I did is I greatly revised and expanded it and added chapters on like slavery in the antebellum South, slavery in the New Testament in the early church, comparative chapter, and then this huge set of appendices. Anyway, the book went from 200 pages to just over 700. And even, and I'll shut up, but even with all of that, just a couple of days ago, I was on a live stream on TikTok with a content creator named Thinker. Excellent, excellent counter apologetics channel. And a guy came on, and I mean, without seemingly batting an eye, said that it was okay for children to be chattel slaves if their parents, if their father or their grandfather or their great grandfather had entered into debt slavery and thereby converted to chattel slavery freely. It's perfectly moral. And it was just like,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
that's why I feel like it's needed.
yeah.
Yeah, it's
I
sad.
It is sad. There's a huge, because I think um besides the scholarly and like critical historical analysis of the text and what the text meant and so forth, the potency and the relevance of this issue is because of the moral nature of the question, that most people are disturbed at owning other humans as property. And, you know, especially the history of the United States, especially the history of the United Kingdom, the European powers, and virtually every, I hate, and I want to be careful because I know sometimes this is weaponized in a way to support slavery. I don't mean it this way, but every culture has always had slaves, like historically has had slaves, and slavery tragically still continues to this day with sex slavery. That still goes on in Europe and in Mexico City, and the human trafficking. It's horrible. Um, so it's like it's really difficult, and it's really hard to take people morally seriously who say that this was okay. It gives a very, ends justifies the means type of thing. And it's just very messy. There's no two ways about it. And it's really morally, for me, I've appreciated all the scholarly work that you've done and that others have done. But I have felt like, yes, this moral exhaustion and moral disgust at people who so ambivalently, and it's also, and it's a matrix or part of a smorgasbord of other issues, especially since 2016, the rise of Christian nationalism and the MAGA movement. It's tied to people that are, pro-theocratic, and it goes back to old Confederate, and in your book you talk about antebellum slave laws and so forth. So this is all in the pot. This is all what's doing. And I think just like showing the broader context of this, because I think in an ideal world, I feel like it would be nice if Hebrew Bible scholars could just be Hebrew Bible scholars doing this type of thing and analyzing the text. And you, specifically, what you were talking about, studying the ancient Near East and so forth, and that's all that happens. But unfortunately, like this stuff is politicized and has been politicized too. It has a history of being politicized as well. It's not like this is new, as you're very well aware of. But I just wanted to say that for context because I do want to ask some questions that are related to the content of the book. But I also just want to put that out there because this is not being discussed for no reason. It's not like random and so forth. And your writing of this book, as you said, has a story. And I really appreciate the clarity that like you've brought to this issue. And a few months ago, I watched your old I don't know how many years ago it was. You can tell me your debate with my debate partner Matt Dillahunty with Cliffe and his brother. I mean, Cliffe and his son rather,
Yeah.
Stuart, I think.
Yeah, Stuart. I want to say that was back in 2021, maybe. I mean, it was a
Okay,
while back. Yeah.
yeah. So and that there were so many things that came up in that debate that I was just like that led to other issues which are valid questions to ask that like Matt raised, but kind of got off the topic a little bit, but not it wasn't irrelevant to the morality of it because like this part of the problem with this issue is that it's so expansive. You could easily get into like discussions about ethics and so forth, but of course it's hard when like a cars used car salesman apologist like Kent Hovid or Eric
Right.
Hovid is like, well, where do you get morality from, bro? And it's like, okay,
Right. I mean, like, so I would, if that were the only argument that people would pose to me, like I would feel better. In the beginning, that's sort of how it was, right?
yeah,
Anytime you'd bring up something about, oh, well, how do you ground your ultimate instantiation of the necessary preconditions for blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I don't know. Go talk to a philosopher, right? That's not me. That's
yeah,
not what I do. I would love to go back to that.
mm,
Unfortunately, the thing that I face now is that like I really thought like it would have never occurred to me. I thought I'd be able to say to apologists, okay, look, you just don't know about these verses. You just don't. And if you
yeah,
know
right,
about them, you've been taught incorrectly about them. So let me just show you
right,
how
yeah,
they endorse the social institution of slavery. And then they would go, oh no, like, well, I have to either come up with a way that it doesn't mean actual slavery, or I have to come up with some like progressive condescension argument that God is moving people out of it. But all of it predicated on the this underlying assumption that slavery bad, right?
hmm
But good God, like what I face now is
mm,
people saying, well, how do you know like why is slavery bad? Like and the thing is, it's like I'm not an ethical philosopher.
yeah,
Like I start there. In the same way that I'm not going to sit there and engage with someone on whether it's right or wrong to rape someone or to
yeah,
murder
right,
someone. Like I'm not
right,
going
yeah,
to have that conversation. In the same way, I'm not going to have a conversation about whether it's right or wrong to own someone as property. Like
hmm
it's just wrong, and I don't lose any sleep at night starting there, right? But
hmm
it's baffling to me that's where the conversation ends up going.
I think part of the issue I think is it's a level of perception and optics where when two people hold to a belief very strongly and there's a dispute, what one of the things that really creates a lot of problems is when you don't know, even if you disagree, if you don't know how you come across to the other side, that it does a lot of damage. And I think there's a lot of I don't want to narrow it down necessarily to like two or three things, but one thing that does come across to me in my viewing of all these debates and so forth has been either they don't know how they come across or they don't really care how they come across. The better ones do care how they come across, but then there's still like for example, I think Cliff and you can correct me if you disagree with this or push back. Cliff comes off to me as someone that means well, but is very dense and has been shown really powerful exegetical proofs and the scholarship, and is just going back to a casuistry and sophistry that he doesn't recognize or is not willing to admit is that. And he equates his um as was it Daniel McKellen says, the renegotiation of the text. He doesn't admit that that's what he's doing, because I could respect someone, and I respect theological traditions that admit that's what they're doing and say that God says they could do that, so they're doing that. um so I so yeah, basically, yeah, I just that's what I want to say. And also, as they say, I feel for you, man. It just, but it's a broader issue too. But it's a good segue though, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you, just for my audience on my humble little channel, is just um, in your book, and I found this really helpful, because in a lot of discussions, you talk about this in the introduction of your book, and then in the conclusion of your book. In a lot of these discussions, you mention how people equivocate on terms, and it's really important to get terms right. So, for example, people will say or ask the question, did the Bible permit slavery? Or they'll say, did the Bible tolerate slavery? Or they will say, did the Bible condone slavery? But the title of your book is, Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? So can you talk about why it's important that your thesis is that the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament too, in a later chapter as well, endorsed slavery? What's the distinction? Like, what's going on there, and like, what are the difference with all this?
Yeah. So I wanted a word. So yeah, I guess a bit of background. Usually the word that gets used in these contexts is condone. And
Mm,
condone can be a fine term for this, but it really depends on how it's being used, because it seems like, and I'm not like an English major, so all you English majors, forgive me here, but the two ways that I understand condone to be used in common usage anyway is to like declare approval for something, almost akin to endorse, maybe a softer form of endorse. But then the more common that I see is like to allow
mm,
something that one thinks is morally wrong, but
mm,
to allow it for a greater purpose, right?
mm,
And so like God condoned it. He condoned it in a way that was like he allowed it, but he didn't like it, but this is what people are doing, Matthew 19, hardness of hearts, whatever. So I don't think, because so many people utilize condone in that way, with the it's morally wrong, but I will allow it for whatever reason. I don't think the Hebrew Bible is condoning in that sense, because I don't think the Hebrew Bible sees the social institution of slavery as wrong. So I use endorse because it's declaring public approval for something. And obviously there are different ways that the word endorse is used, but when you have the laws saying, if you want to own slaves, here's where you get them. Like that is a declaration of the public of a public declaration of approval for the social institution of slavery. And you even have more definitive passages than that, right? Where you have Deuteronomy 21, and Deuteronomy 21 has a very clear command that if people put up a fight, the men are to be killed, and the women, the children, the cattle are all to be taken as plunder, right? Ostensibly to become slaves. So, I don't think that the Hebrew Bible balks at all at giving public declaration of approval for owning other people as property. But another word that I think might be suitable, and if I had to pick a different one, I would use sanction. Like it sanctions it. Because both of
yeah.
these, they don't carry any, well, we think it's bad, but we're going to allow it nuance, because that's what I was
Yeah.
assiduously trying to avoid.
Hmm.
And so I have gotten a lot of pushback on that because when people hear endorse, and this is fine, like because I think it's a very normal thing to do, which is why we have these conversations. People hear endorse and they hear like a presidential candidate. I endorse this message, right? And and in a sense, that's still true, right? I think they think um, maybe it's like a sports player endorsing Pepsi, right? You should buy Pepsi. And if you're, that's also true, right? Of how the Hebrew Bible views the social institution of slavery. Deuteronomy 21 says, doesn't say like if you want to, you can take them as plunder. And no, we take them as plunder. So I don't think there's a lot of wiggle room there. But the bottom line is this is that there is public declaration of approval for the social institution. And I thought endorse was probably the right word to use to capture that to capture that nuance. But again, I think that sanction would also work well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's very helpful. One of the things that really stuck out to me at the ending of your book, towards the in the conclusion, is you mentioned how the nature of the legal codes in the Hebrew Bible with regards to slavery, and um and also inferring too from like what you wrote in context, I assume would apply to other sanctions and commands given by Yahweh to the ancient Israelites, that the nature of these codes was not meant to be stopped. They were meant to be eternal. Is that an accurate like assessment of what you're saying? And I understand there's a history of obviously interpretation and so forth, but just at least in the original historical critical context of the Hebrew Bible, are all these laws about slavery and the treatment of them and as property, and also all the various laws, whether it's like Leviticus 25, inheritance and so forth, and beating of slaves, is there any indication at all that that is only going to be temporary, as is often like argued by apologists?
No, and I mean you hit the nail on the head, right? When someone says theological framework or
Hmm.
different, traditional interpretations, sure.
Hmm.
When if you're taking second Esdras into account when you're looking at the book of
Right.
Daniel, then you're going to it's very easy to say, oh, well, Greece wasn't supposed to be the fourth kingdom. It's actually supposed to be Rome. Well, and if somebody says, well, look, here in the book of Daniel, you could be like, yeah, but look in the book of Esdras, it says he didn't have all the information, right? And so here's who it actually is, actually Rome. So if one is taking Ezekiel into account, right? If one is taking the New Testament into account, then yeah, like there are things if people are taking Jeremiah 31 into account, right, in this interpretive framework, then sure, like you can say, yeah, but new covenant coming, right? And we've got, look here at what foreigners, how they're going to be brought in. See, like all this. The problem is that I'm not engaging with the text as if it were univocal. And this is required for this interpretive framework is this type of univocality that there is one overarching author to all of this, which is God. And I'm not viewing the text that way. That's not an academic approach to the text, at least from a critical historical view. And that's what we're talking about. So if you go back and read through the book of Leviticus or Deuteronomy, and you see these are to be eternal statutes throughout all your generations, there's not a notion that this happened for a while, then go away, right? Like that's not there. Um, and so I think that for people that are trying to make this argument that God gave these laws through Moses in such a way that later he could come back and say, like in Matthew 19, yeah, I let you do that through Moses, but it was because you guys were bad. And, I couldn't, or I didn't just stop you from doing it, but it was because of the hardness of your hearts that happened. If you're coming at the text from that perspective, yeah, you can do all kinds of stuff with it. I still think you have hurdles, right? Cliff, I said this to Cliff when we had that debate. Like, Cliff, you can't just cite Matthew 19 and then like step back and drop your microphone. It doesn't work that way. I mean, the most that you've done here is connect it to divorce in Deuteronomy 24, right? But even then, and this is the great irony of the Matthew 19 argument, sorry, but Jesus doesn't say you can't divorce. Right? He doesn't like stop the issue of divorce in Matthew 19. It's still allowable. It's restricted, but it's still allowable. So what's the argument here? Like if we're trying to connect this to slavery, it's like, okay, so what? Slavery's still allowable? You just have to do it right? Like I don't is sick flex, bruh, you know? So anyway, I think the big problem here is that these laws in the Hebrew Bible, these law collections, were seen by their writers as in their particular context, things that were to be carried out in perpetuity. And so I
Mm.
think having this later argument where we're trying to say that was bad, but God allowed it temporarily, and so we're finding later texts to sort of speak to that doesn't engage honestly. That's equivocation in my opinion, because we're not coming at the text utilizing the same interpretive framework.
Yeah, yeah. That's really good. A few episodes ago now, um, I'm trying to make more episodes, just life keeps on happening and stuff, but I had a conversation with a friend of mine, Kevin, who was like me, used to be Catholic, and he's agnostic now. And I've kind of been ping-ponging back and forth about like basically with my own beliefs and like deconstructing, reconstructing, deconstructing again, deconstructing again. um, but one of the things that really frustrates me in these conversations is that, and it's conversations like this too, where whether it's like very conservative evangelicals or many conservative Catholics, um, there's often just sometimes like and in my experience, I will say I think Catholics do a better job, but there still are times where there's different apologists where it's like, no, like doing some bad stuff and or fallacious logical thinking and so forth. Where I'm just like, can we just get like the bare minimum of like recognition of certain facts or whatever? And because one of the things that you mentioned, um, because for me, if you this is not a perfect analogy, but if I could put it this way, I feel like the historical critical method is like people that produce bricks and people doing theology and philosophy and philosophical theology and so forth. They're taking the bricks and building stuff out of it. The people that make the bricks don't tell you how to put the bricks together. It's just bricks. That's all they do. It's like, here's the brick. We don't tell you what to make or whatever. But don't say it's not a brick. Don't try to redefine what a brick is. Don't tell brick makers how to make bricks. um, and I think in a lot of people like Cliff and so forth, there's a lot of because one of the examples I'm thinking of that was very frustrating and kind of just cringy to hear and just like, oh my gosh, gave me a headache. In the debate that you had with him, with Matt Dillahunty, there was a point in the debate where during the cross examination where you said something to the effect, I can't remember the precise, quote, but the effect was, you're not basically you're not reading this text correctly, and you're trying to like point him to exegesis of like Leviticus 25 and Exodus 21. And he responds with, um, uh, he said, "Well, to be fair, Josh, you've been saying that I've been a poor and oh, I'm sorry. He's you said sorry. Let me back up. Cliff Cliff got offended, saying that you implied that he was poorly interpreting the text, and and then he basically said that you were poorly or inferred that you were poorly interpreting the text. And you said, "Wow, thanks for saying that I'm not interpreting the text correctly." And then he said, "Well, to be fair, you've been saying that about me." And I was just like, "But to be fair, Cliff, like Josh has been the one throughout this whole debate that's been like actually reading the Bible straight out in context." And that was very frustrating because it's kind of ironic too, because evangelicals usually pride themselves in knowing their Bible very well.
Yeah.
So it was kind of just a bit ironic. And so that's all of that to say, sorry for the confusion there. It's been a long day. um,
No, and I
but
think
yeah.
to sort of build a little on your analogy, because I think it's a good one. My son really, my 6-year-old, he really likes Hot Wheels, and he's got all these different Hot Wheels tracks. Some of them connect to others,
Oh
some of
yeah.
them don't, right? Not that
Yeah.
that's frustrating to me as a parent. Far be it from me to be frustrated at that. But, if you have like a Mario Hot Wheels track, and then you have like a dinosaur Hot Wheels track,
Hmm.
and you tie them together to make like Mario Dino. These
Hmm.
are it's like these are two Hot Wheels tracks that were not intended to go together, right?
Hmm.
But if
Yeah.
you can like find ways to connect them somehow, maybe not terribly well.
Hmm.
But I think if we do that and then we say, now see, like there is a way, like there's a story in Hot Wheels where Super Mario Brothers actually engaged with Tyrannosaurus Rex because look, we have
Hmm.
this combined, Mario Dino Hot Wheels set. You would say, okay, like if you're doing fan fiction or something, cool. But I mean, you can't, this was a separate entity. And this was a separate entity. Now, you as an author, if you've brought them together, as a creator, you've brought them together to create this new world, fine. Right. But it would be a lot like, if a rapper today, if Eminem today were to, he did his I love Remind Me, I think is the name of the song. And it uses a lot of Joan Jett's riffs from I Love Rock and Roll. If someone were to, now he's taking, this is what Eminem does, or it's what all I think good artists do, is they take aspects of various genres and they bring them together in a new way. And I think that if I were to then say, "Oh, Joan Jett, look at all this sexually explicit stuff in Eminem's song. I can't believe Joan Jett would say stuff like that." Right? That would be unfair. I can't read back in if he made some euphemism about a jukebox, right? I can't read that back into Joan Jett's use of the term jukebox because he's that's an additional, a wider interpretive framework. He's reusing and recontextualizing earlier motifs or lyrics or whatever. Okay. In the same way, it's perfectly fine and good in whatever way that we want to define good there, from an artistic standpoint, from a creative standpoint, for a later writer. Take the Gilgamesh epic, for example. The Gilgamesh epic is was created from independent Sumerian stories about Gilgamesh. And Sin Lake Unini brought the writer brought these together and created an epic in such a way as to make a new statement, a new theological and new ideological set of statements, right? Well, you can't if he added another interpretive layer to one of the stories, the independent stories, you can't then go back to that independent Sumerian story and be like, "Oh my gosh, I wonder what Gilgamesh was thinking here in this story, knowing that he was getting ready to die." Because in the epic, he dies in the next section, right? You can't do that because you can't read that back into the original story because that wasn't implied there. And I think in the same way, someone saying, "Well, gosh, like we know from, Matthew 19 that in Deuteronomy 24, when Moses is giving this, but he's giving this just because the people are, I wonder, like, can we see that in Deuteronomy 24? But I wonder if we can, like, what other implications what inferences can we use to, like, no, you can't do that. It's a later writer trying to grapple with attention in the text, attention in the traditions. You just can't do that. And I think that's where the difference between theological interpretive models and frameworks and historical critical method, you can't mix the two that way. And critique you can't critique the historical critical method by utilizing a broader theological interpretive method. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, because the original intention and authorial intention of the texts of the Hebrew Bible, it's very different than a particular, especially like, I mean, very especially, like modern evangelical apologetic interpretations.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, for sure. And one of the things too I wanted to ask you was, I had a conversation recently with someone, and I was struggling to um, put it into the right words because I hadn't read your book for a while, and I was we were out and stuff, and so I didn't like have. I was trying to Google stuff on my phone, but then it was dying, and I was like, but it's this idea though that because we were talking about like slavery and the Hebrew Bible and so forth, and they were surprised that I was like conceding the uh well, and it was funny. They were surprised that I was conceding that the Hebrew Bible endorsed slavery, and I was like, well, that's just the academic consensus. I'm not like really conceding anything. I'm just admitting a fact, which I know that I know other people would be like, really, but but the thing that I was having a hard time communicating to him was that he was like, well, they viewed people as like slaves, as not people back then, and I was like, no, and he was like, what? And I was like, yeah, and I said, like, as Americans, whether we recognize it or not, we have a tendency, because of the history of slavery in this country and the history of like social Darwinism and the eugenics movement and Aryan racial hierarchies and Lamarckianism and Hitler and Mein Kampf and so forth, where there was this view of like they're inferior, they're dirt. There's literally a hierarchy of your worth on a chart, like Hitler, like Aryan chart shows like gradations of where the different races were. And the what's the old pseudoscience phrenology, where they examined
Mm.
black people's skulls and to try to basically say like, see, they're dumb or whatever, or they deserve to be enslaved because we're superior, white people are superior, blah blah blah. And I was like, that's not what's going on. I'm not saying there's no class hierarchy or there's no power dynamics. Obviously there is, clearly, but it was hard for them to see this because they were like, but the Bible, and they're not like, they weren't Christian, they were raised Christian, but they were like, but the Bible teaches the image of God. So the question, I'll pose the question to you: how can the Hebrew Bible talk about people being made in the image of God and be okay with slavery? Like,
Yeah.
how does that make any sense? Because in their mind, if you're creating the image of God, you have, and again, it's later theological reflections and so forth that's in many traditions of Protestantism and Catholicism that talk about, the image and sanctity of the human person has infinite dignity and so forth. And so they're thinking like that. And so they're saying, well, how can you own someone as property? Because that would rob them of their dignity that they have by being made in the image of God. So yeah, how are those two things compatible in the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah. So this is another example, I think, of utilizing a later interpretive framework and reading back into the text intended meaning. And it's very easy to do. So I'm not necessarily knocking anyone for doing that. There was a great article by John Day on the image of God, a good chapter actually. It's in his most I think it's his most recent book. I have to go back and look, but and we actually don't have a lot of data on the what the image of God meant. And there are a couple of different positions, and I won't like bore everybody with them, but essentially what's being wrapped into this phrase, the made in the image and likeness of God, probably has two aspects, right? A physical aspect is probably the primary, right? When you have Seth being born in the image and likeness of his father, right? This doesn't carry any like divine, there's there's no like ruling functionality involved with it or something. Um, so a lot of this has to do, I think most scholars would say that this has a lot to do with God is how God was seen physically, right? He's got a body, kind of like we look like him, right? Is the idea. Now, in the flood story in Genesis 9, following the flood, you're not supposed to shed a man's blood because he's in the image of God. And so there probably is there, I think arguably a there's a non-corporeal aspect to it, right? Probably has something to do with like the cognitive abilities, you know, there are there are immaterial aspects. But what it's not is what we read into this Imago Dei today, right? Which is like, sorry, I don't know why this just intrusive thought popped into my head, but I just thought every sperm is sacred. Um, so, um, right? There is not this conception in the Hebrew Bible that there is this type of fundamental equality, right? Or uh, every life is sacred in this sense that so many people, I think, understand it today. For example, and you have to go with the data, right? This is what's critical. You have to test one's theory against the data. That's a truism, but anyway. So when you go to passages that are, relatively old in the Hebrew Bible, like Exodus 21 with the covenant code, and you see things like if uh, two men are fighting and they hit a pregnant woman and there's a miscarriage, but the woman is fine after, like, there's no additional harm that comes to her. It's a monetary payment, right? And this is completely consistent with what we see in the other law collections in the ancient Near East. The same sort of thing happens. The same is true, or a similarly problematic thing is true when we see verses 28 to 32 in the same chapter, where you had the law about the goring ox. If it gores a free man, free woman, free child, then the owner of the ox, his life is forfeit. Now he can ransom himself if the family sets a price that they will accept to, for him to ransom his life. But I mean, like, his life is forfeit. if that same ox gores a slave, it's 30 pieces of silver. It's the penalty. And it's paid to the owner of the slave. So, like, if we're going to try to read the Imago Dei and this, every life is considered, in the image of God in the sense that all are sacred and all are fundamentally equal and all of these things, like, you have to grapple with texts like that. And, one of the things that I think we miss is that our conception of what it means to oppress, our conception of what it means to treat immorally when it comes to engaging with other human beings is sometimes different from how it was seen in antiquity, including the Hebrew Bible. And so people read passages like Leviticus 19:33 and 34, and they say, "Oh my gosh, like love the ger, love like the resident alien as you love yourself." That's pretty strong language. Um, you have other passages that say, like, do not oppress the foreigner, do not oppress the resident alien, do not oppress the toshav, the tenant farmer that's in your midst. We think, well, gosh, like, oppress. Slavery is oppression. Thank God they think that, right? At least those apologists think that. But the problem is that that word that's used there and that concept of oppression, it doesn't follow that slavery falls into that category. It clearly does not.
Yeah.
And so in the same way that if 1,000 years from now, loaning someone money at interest were considered across the board immoral, or a better example, and I actually use this one in the book, I think. If, right now, I think across the country, really probably across the world, more and more people are coming to recognize that beating your children, corporal punishment's a bad thing, right? But let's say in like 50 years or 100 years, it's like universal. Everybody agrees corporal punishment bad, right? And we go back to the Proverbs and we read Proverbs 13, one among many passages that talk about this. And it says, if you beat your son with a wooden rod, that's how you show him that you love him. If you truly love him, you will beat him with a wooden rod. It would be unfair to read that text and to say, well, it can't mean beat them with a wooden rod. This must be a metaphor, right? And people try to do that today, right? This is a metaphorical rod. But the reality is that loving one's son today, it doesn't necessarily follow that that's how they loved their children back then or in the 1940s. So it would be unfair, I think, to say a father necessarily did not love his son in 1953 if he beat him with a switch. Because I love my child and I wouldn't beat them with a switch because I know now from my moral vantage point that that's wrong. But I can't it doesn't follow that I can say that that father did not love them. Now, maybe he didn't, right? Sure, there are many, many examples where they didn't, right? But we can't do it based on just that data point alone. And so that's what I would say about the Imago Dei is one, it's I think it's fundamentally misunderstood. And we're reading back into those phrases far more than the text intended. And then secondly, trying to make a connection between that and slavery by making this assumption that all people were considered like fundamentally equal before God. It's just a non-starter that you're not going to get that from the text.
Yeah, I appreciate that because that's just being honest with what the text says. and recognizing that there is various, class hierarchy, slave master relationships, and let alone what the Hebrew Bible would say about like polygamy or women in general, because that's another, um, and also what social class of woman that we're talking about, female slaves versus
That's right.
um, free women and so forth. Um, I think one of the things that's difficult is, and it's something that I'm still like trying to process and determine like what exactly I do with this as well. But I think part of the reason for like why a lot of fundamentalists and conservative evangelicals and other apologist types get uncomfortable with what you're saying, because what you're saying is not untrue, but I think
Mm.
what's happening is it's really hard and messy to talk about the evolution of morality in different societies. Um, and there's some, depending what type of moral philosophy you take, there's some uncomfortable positions you could come to. But even without coming to a specific controversial philosophy perspective, there's just some pretty uncomfortable questions to ask if you're going to be engaging with the text of the Hebrew Bible in its context. Doing a close reading of it and asking the questions that need to be asked and so forth. And I also think people get scared about the lack of solidity and various fears of um and disagreements with too, like moral relativism and so forth, or different forms of that. And this sense of where, because a lot of them, I hear this sense of where they're coming from, especially people like Gavin Ortlund, where there's a sense of like like a lot of his defenses come off as damage control, because like when
Mm.
you really read into the text, it's like, yeah, I mean, that's what it's like. That's this is what's happening. And so I feel like you could easily go into like a spiraling of like nothing means anything, everything is so like, we need stability basically. And I think that's where a lot of
Mm.
them are coming from. I'm not saying that's right, but it just seems like um that often seems to be somewhat approximating like where they're coming from, at least partially. I'm not saying necessarily holistically across the
Sure.
board, but it definitely plays a factor. And yeah, so I think because I remember when you were talking about the image of God, I forget what stream it was. I think, oh yeah, it was over the summer. I don't know if I'm saying this right, but Dapper Dino or Dino
Mm.
Dapper. He did a
Pepperdine, yeah.
Yeah, he did a stream on slavery with Kipp. And I'm sorry, I forget the girl that was with them. But they did a stream
Oh,
on slavery.
was it Vishanti?
No, it wasn't Vish. I love Vish. She's really great. Like that's that man. Like she does not hold back either.
No, she doesn't.
There was like there was one time, and I love Kip too, but there was one time. Oh no, I'm confusing it with a different time. I was actually going to say Dr. Bird. Um,
Ah.
because there was there was a moment, maybe I'll edit this out, but there was a moment in the stream about the Canaanite conquest when it was you, Matthew Monger, Dr. Bird, and Daniel McKellen. Is my saying that right? Daniel McKellen or
McClellan.
McClellan? We're all on together, and David from Deep Drinks
Yeah.
podcast, and Kip said something to the effect, "I'm sure that Gavin's historical theology research is good." And then Dr. Bird was like, "I'm not so sure about that."
That was pretty
she's like,
good.
she's like, "That's a silly thing to say," and I was like, "Damn."
Yeah, yeah. That was good. That was pretty funny.
And I was like, "She's not wrong though."
Yeah,
But
I mean
yeah,
it's funny.
yeah. But I was gonna say too, a huge factor that plays into this, and this is something that's also often denied by conservative apologists, is that um kind of a 30,000 foot view, or a broader thing going on in the Hebrew Bible that was really like um pretty earth shattering when I researched this more. Because at first I just like hand waved it away. I was like, oh, that's just liberal or whatever. But it's the evolution of the concept of and understanding of ancient Israelite religion
Mm,
relating to God's nature. Because most scholars will tell you that most of or parts of the Pentateuch, the Torah, have this atomistic humanoid god deity Yahweh, um, who was, he had male genitalia, he had two legs and so forth. It was very humanoid. He changed his mind because not because that was the anthropomorphism commented on by John Calvin in the 16th century and then other patristic authors, because God is absolutely simple. But no, in the ancient understanding of Yahweh, Yahweh was not omniscient. He
yeah.
he changed his mind. He was a he This is where I get, and correct me if I'm wrong, I get a little bit confused on some of the evolution with this. But from what I understand, he was either a war god first or a storm god first. I forget what order. I think that's debated, right?
Yeah, I don't know that we know that.
Okay.
Yeah, the origins of Yahwism and Yahweh are still very
Oh, gotcha.
contested. If
Okay, because
people
I've
are
heard.
interested, Dan Fleming has good work on this. Um, there's a recent book by I don't know why I always forget his name. Oh, that's so terrible. That's just terrible. It's down on my shelf. It's talking about metallurgy. God is a metallurgy. I was a metallurgy god. Anzalag.
Oh, okay.
That's why I forget it because it's not a name that I hear a lot. Uh, yeah, and of course, Ted Lewis in his massive tome on the origin and character of God. That's a recent, like a 2020 publication, I think. So yeah, those are good places that people can go and sort of
Yeah.
do some reading on that if they're interested. But yeah, it's debated.
Yeah, it's very fascinating, and I have some books on my Amazon wish list I plan on reading on this. Um, but sure, like even with the debate, there's you have that going on, and then and also correct me if I'm wrong, from what I understand, because it's been a while since I've like read into this, but then you have more of like a high god of like Isaiah, Amos, Obadiah, the prophets, Jeremiah, um, and Job, and so forth. Um, and I think what the point I'm getting at is that what makes a lot of people uncomfortable is that the Bible doesn't have one theology. Different books have different theologies. Different books have different parts of different books have different authors. Um, Depending what we're talking about, like if we're talking about Deuteronomy, Isaiah, or we're talking about the Book of Daniel and so forth. There's compilation, there's redaction, and so forth. And I know that's like, because even for me, that's like something I don't think I would ever believe. Because I used to believe in inerrancy. I used to believe in a monolithic, like a lot of like older, like the evangelical biblical theology type of stuff. Um, and it's hard, but I think because one of the things that's going on here is people are assuming univocality, and people are also they have a difficulty with like simultaneity of different streams of belief, and being like, well, wait, it says the image of God here and take care of the poor and advocate for justice and so forth here. So that's it. And like, as I'm sure you would agree, if you're going to interpret everything else by that, go ahead. Like, that's
Right.
great.
Right, exactly.
But at the same time, though, to pretend that the covenant code isn't there, or Leviticus 25, um, I think it's just not being honest with the text. Even if you wanted to do something theologically, philosophically with that, I think there needs to be intellectual honesty in admitting the type of I don't mean this pejoratively, but admitting the type of game you're playing.
Yes.
That's not the best word to use, but it's all I can think of right now. But because otherwise, yeah, it's like what you said before. We're going to be saying that this later theology was the original authorial intent,
Yeah.
and the historical meaning, and it's like, well, that's not really true if you dig deeper and go into the source. So, one thing I wanted to ask, it's kind of a related it's a related question, but it's not specifically about slavery.
Okay.
But um, so your book, while it was inspiring in terms of like I was nerding out with it, it's also and I'm not blaming you at all, but I'm just like this was also very depressing to read.
Yes.
I was just like, well, dang. But one of the things that kind of went on off in my mind was I was like, well, if Dr. Bowen is arguing and saying that the laws about slavery are supposed to be like in the historical context, in perpetuity, like not perpetual, not to be ceased. Um, wouldn't that also apply to passages about other subjects like death penalty for disobedient children, or the dietary laws, or very controversially for at least men who have sex with other men, even if they didn't understand the because I understand like the whole mental health concepts that we have today, and the whole idea of sexual orientation didn't really exist back then in the way that we understand that. But at the end of the day, we all know that the only people that are men that have sex with men are LGBT people. So, um, would that also be the case, at least in the historical context, that the Levitical law is supposed to be continued, at
Yeah.
least historically?
Yeah. Again, if we're thinking about the intent of the Pentateuchal writers in the schools, like, and there's nothing in the text that I can think of that would lead me to believe that the audience that was hearing these texts
Hmm.
thought anything except we do this from now on.
Hmm.
And I mean, certainly the audience of Deuteronomy, you know, the text is going to great lengths to say, uh, this covenant is with you. It's not with anybody else. It's not with, it's got like it's being made with somebody else, and it's got to be brought across the sea to you or brought down from heaven to you. No, it's here with you today, you, all of us standing here. Like the Hebrew is very emphatic. So, the idea that this was somehow understood by them to be some sort of a temporary measure. Uh, no, I mean, like throughout your generations is the phrase that is recurring over and over again. This will be an eternal statute for you. Um, so yeah, I think that's going to just apply broadly to everything that you see in these law collections. I guess I'd have to see an argument from someone as to why they think within the internal frame of reference of the narrative itself,
Right. Yes. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
why they would think that it would be something that would stop.
And to be clear, like we're both fully affirming of LGBT people,
Oh, of
and
course.
yeah. So, but I mention that because that's scary because I know there are people. There's been I forget his name, but there was a Texas pastor like a year or two ago that was like preaching about that we should execute homosexuals, and he was citing Leviticus. And
Yeah.
this is something I struggle with for a lot of, because like I care about the historical context of things, and like that's just the nerd OCD, like what it means type of thing about me, because I've had some. kind of difficult conversations, difficult in the sense of like, I don't think I was getting my point across because when I didn't always used to be affirming. So when I was talking to more progressive Christians who were affirming, and when I was coming to the point of like accepting, LGBT people, one of the difficult things though, I was like, so how do we make Leviticus not say what it says? And I understand for the New Testament, I think, to be honest, I think there's better ways in the New Testament than in the Hebrew Bible. But the the point I'm getting at is just the principle is kind of hard, even though I'm still open and I could be wrong. Um, it's just difficult for me to see sometimes, or like, I mean, I've heard people say, "Well, that doesn't count" or whatever. I'm like, okay, if we just like, fine, all right, and if you don't believe in inerrancy or whatever, or like that, that's like outdated or whatever. Okay, fine, that's all right, fair. But I just asked. The reason why I asked that though was just to kind of show kind of the force of like the nature of these laws, because a lot of apologists, as we've been talking, have kind of treated them as sort of contextual, conditioned, um, in a temporary way. Like, yes, they're contextual, and yes, there are conditions, but it's not in the way that they're thinking of that. So,
Yeah, Kipp and I recorded a video that's going to be going up on Apologia's channel
oh,
in the
sweet.
near future. And it's a response to Dr. Carmen Imes, and her lengthy interview that she did on Sean McDowell's channel on the topic of slavery. And like I get along with Carmen. Uh, you know, like I've never met her, but I mean we've interacted a little bit. I did a review on one of her interviews. And I mean I think we're cordial with one
Mhm.
another. But this was a video that I thought, while her apologetics are better, and when I say better, I mean at least to some degree, they try to wrestle more with the atrocities than some. In the end, I think her positions are still dangerous. And that's not trying to say anything specifically against her, right? I think it's a common position that she holds, right? In that context, it's not like a shot at her, but I think the positions are dangerous. And one of the things that she said was trying to make an argument that the Ten Commandments, these are more timeless, right? These are like timeless prohibitions. And the rest, they're casuistic laws and they're not epidictic laws. And so, they're not meant for like the ideal society. And I spent some time in this video saying, the fuck? like what? You know,
Yeah.
I mean, look, I get that these Ten Commandments tend to be more general. Not really, but I mean,
Yeah.
like people think about them like don't murder. Okay, cool. Don't steal. Okay, cool. Like don't lie. It's not really what it says, but okay, it's close enough. But yeah, so I get that like, oh, well, these look, they're in this apodictic, do this or don't do this, right? That's different from if this happens, then do this. So these must be like more timeless. Well, okay. Like I point out, like, don't suffer a witch to live. That's apodictic. Is that timeless? Like, is this for the ideal society? Like, and we have a bunch of the same kinds of laws that are in casuistic form that they would want to be timeless, right? So it's just, I guess what I'm saying is that people people start with their conclusions and back into the data. And that's a really bad way to do this. in my opinion.
Yeah, I was gonna say towards the end of your book, in the conclusion, you talk about how many people um, start with their conclusion and then read it into the data, and it kind of becomes a vicious circle. And to a degree, I do think I don't want to fully let anyone off the hook for doing this, but to a degree, it's somewhat psychologically understandable, at least like in an initial state. But it's not the preferable. Like it also comes off as also like very like what children do, like childlike. Um, because obviously everyone has biases, and the only cure to that is just better understanding of other points of view, even if you eventually end up disagreeing. The problem in this discussion, though, is that, and what's frustrating about it, and what makes me like feel your frustration too, is that we're not talking about opinions. We're talking about what the text factually says and what the academic consensus is. And it's not like it's all these evil liberal atheist scholars. The
That's right.
majority of them are Jewish and Christian scholars. And I, I understand sometimes you can get into this hellhole where even if you point that out to certain people that the majority of them are Christian and Jewish scholars, then they'll say, well, they're probably liberal or whatever. But then if you give them a conservative scholar that's saying the same thing, sometimes, and I've heard this before, they'll say like, well, that's not really conservative. And I'm like, okay, it just
Right.
becomes no true Scotsman,
Of
like
course.
all the way down.
100%.
And it's so frustrating. And yeah, is there a way you deal with that in particular, or is it just kind of like, I don't know.
Alcohol? No, I'm kidding. You know, I had a
Vodka
convers
straight? No.
I had a conversation today on Clubhouse while I was baking some cookies to be decorated. And, you know, it's mindless activity to kind of bake cookies. And I it felt like that started to translate into this conversation that I was having online
Hmm.
because I was brought into a conversation to talk about the dating of the book of Daniel. I came into a room to listen, and somebody was like, "Oh, Dr. Josh is here. Dr. Josh, can you come and explain dating with Daniel?" Okay, fine. Um, then the conversation moved more generally into uh, prophecy.
Hmm.
And I don't know if you remember Harold Camping. Harold Camping was the president of Family Radio back in like the 2000s. And
Okay, that sounds familiar.
he started, you might recognize it as I tell the story. He started to talk about how the rapture was going to take place on March 21st, 2011.
Oh, yep, yep, yep,
And he ran this program called the Open Forum. And 5 nights a week for I think an hour and
yep.
a half, he did this call-in program. Good evening, folks. How are you tonight? Again, may I have the privilege and the pleasure of coming into your home to visit with you for a little while. Anyway, and I used to listen to it, believe it or not. And the guy in the stream said, "Look, Harold Camping predicted that Jesus was going to come back in the rapture, and it didn't happen." And the Christian in the room said, "Yeah, but he's not doing hermeneutics. He's not taking the whole Bible." And I said, "Yeah, but he would." I mean, believe me, I know this. I listened to Harold Camping for years. Harold Camping, like he brought up, oh, this passage in Matthew, and here it says, man knows the day of the hour. Yeah, okay, great. But like, you don't think somebody brought that to Harold's attention? You don't think he
Yeah,
addressed that 6 times a night?
yeah,
Like
right,
he
right.
had an interpretive methodology that accounted for that.
Yeah,
You just think he's wrong. Like that's all
yeah,
this is.
right,
Your interpretive methodology accounts for the data different than his interpretive methodology accounts for the data.
right.
And the person, said, "Oh no, because if you read this passage," and I'm like, "Listen, this isn't a question about who's right and who's wrong. Right? This is a question about both of you are saying we take all of God's word to be inspired. We take all of God's word to be our data set.
Right. Yeah.
And the passage that you're citing, I cite that passage as well, right? And I understand it
Right.
differently because of all the other texts. And
Right.
I have my arguments for it, and you have your arguments for yours. So who adjudicates,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
guy kept coming back with, yeah, but if you think about this verse, it's like, oh my God, like, are you just, oh, so yes, I think that this no true Scotsman all the way down.
Yeah.
Where I ended up in this discussion was I said, look, if you went to ETS, the Evangelical Theological Society, if you went to their annual
Yeah.
meeting and you went into a uh, like
Yeah.
um, an eschatology session, right?
Right. Yeah.
And a preterist got up and gave his view on the end of days.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a PhD from, I don't know, Fuller Theological Seminary, let's say,
Yeah.
right? He's been teaching at Wheaton. I don't know. Fuck, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
But he's been teaching for 30 years. He gets up and gives a paper. And then another just as credentialed
Yeah.
premillennialist gets
Yep.
up and gives his paper. And they're fundamentally opposed to one another. There's no way that one of them could look at the other and say, yeah, but you're not taking all of scripture into account. The fuck
Yeah.
I'm not, right? Like,
Right.
of
Yeah.
course they are. It's just they have different interpretations. It's a whole point. So
Yeah.
yeah, I agree. It's very frustrating. Um, I think even though it doesn't seem like it from how I'm venting to you right now, I think patience has been a thing that I've tried to exhibit in those contexts. But yes, it is. I have no secret weapon. I have no secret weapon
Yeah. Yeah.
to deal with it.
Yeah, that makes me think of similar issues like, Calvinists and Arminians. Well, what do you do with John 3:16? What do you do from passages from 1st and 2nd Peter and so on and so forth? And yeah, it comes down to difference of methodology, difference of philosophical commitments to
Yep.
predestination and free will
In
and
my
so forth.
in my seminary, and then I'll shut up, sorry.
No, you're
In my
fine.
seminary, when I was going through a very conservative fundamentalist evangelical seminary, I remember I was taking a Greek class and we were translating through Romans.
Mm.
And we translated through Romans 9. And it wasn't a
Yeah.
big school, right? Like the building itself was not terribly big. And it was an evening class, and I'm sitting there and I gave a translation. And Dr. Edgar, Thomas Edgar, was my Greek professor. And he said, as you can see, whatever verse it was, right? As you can see, this clearly shows that predestination, like this view of predestination, is not accurate, right? And there was this bit of silence as a couple students were like writing some notes or something. And Dr. James Mook, who was the theology head over in the adjacent room, at this moment says about the same verse in a systematic theology course. And so here we can clearly see in Romans 9 that predestination is exactly what the apostle intended here. Like two educated colleagues in the same seminary that were very good friends in classrooms right next to each other said the same verse meant diametrically opposed things. Like it's the way that theology works. It's the way that interpretations work.
Right, yeah, because texts are not self-interpreting, and that's the difficulty with holding to like a more of a Chicago statement, inerrancy type of view, and even other like
Yeah.
Protestant beliefs of sola scriptura. And I understand that there are versions of Protestantism, of course, that will account for like tradition and other interpretations and so forth. But within the Chicago statement type of paradigm of inerrancy, it's pretty hard to yeah, you just don't. You can't say, "Hey, Bible, what did you mean?" Like, because
Right, exactly,
it's not
exactly.
alive. It's so. Um, but yeah, I appreciate that, Dr. Bowen. If you don't mind, because there one thing I wanted to ask you. I should have asked this a while ago, but um, how would you? Because in your book you do this. How would you define the word slavery
Hmm.
in the Hebrew Bible? I know there's different types of slavery. You go through it in your book, like chattel and like the
Yeah,
various like conquest, plunder, and controversially, sex slavery for
yeah.
yeah.
Um, yeah, that's good. So yeah, I mean, I think that I have a definition that I thought through quite a bit, and I probably won't be able to pull it off the top of my head. But it's something akin to, let me back up. Slavery, defining slavery in the ancient world is like a perennially difficult problem. And the reason for that is that it's like trying to define the word run.
Hmm.
Like, how do you define run? Well, I mean, if you're trying to find all the different ways that the word run could be used, yeah, you're going to have a very difficult time finding like one meaningful overarching definition. However, if you narrowed it down to like you put tennis shoes on and are on a track moving your feet quickly, in that narrow context, you can more easily distinguish run from other non-running things, right? In the same way, slavery, the word eved, or like Semitic words like wardu, for slave, or amtum, or even in Sumerian like gemetu or something, like these are terms that are broad. They're used very in a lot of different contexts. And so when people talk about like the problem of trying to find an overarching definition of slavery, it's because they're expressing the difficulty of trying to find something that captures everything from somebody who works in somebody else's field and is beaten and is owned as property, and all the way up to like a king who is the Eved of, or a Wardu of the god, right? Or a petty king that's a Wardu, a slave of a senior king, right? Like those are very different, um, relationships. And so I think that in this context, I narrow my focus to the former, right? Where I'm talking about in these social contexts where you have people owning other people as property, where you have in the law collections distinctions between free person, and slave. And free person, of course, is its own bucket of problems. But so in that context, what I generally say is that it's when one person owns another person as property. That condition can be temporary or permanent. Now it's nuanced, and again, even in that context, you have to nuance it because owning someone as property temporarily is very different from owning them permanently. For example, just not thinking in the Hebrew Bible, just thinking wider ancient Near East. If someone is taken as a pledge, if a girl, for example, is taken as a pledge, a daughter, that master, that owner, the creditor that has taken her as a pledge can't just then like give her away to somebody to be married off. He has to get permission from the father first to do that. Um, so there are restrictions when somebody is taken as a pledge or taken as a debt slave because it's assumed that their status is ultimately going to be free again. And so they retain certain rights. Uh, a chattel slave, somebody that is converted to permanent slavery, those rights change. They still have rights, they're just far fewer. And and so I think trying to find a definition that that still is adequate to cover those bases. It's not something that the definition usually would just stand by itself. You have to kind of talk about it, right? It's, it's like you have to give it a sermon in that sense. So yeah, but it's someone that's being owned as property either temporarily or permanently. And the big thing that you see from this master slave relationship is that the labor or the benefit that gets generated from that slave is not for themselves. It is or can be taken uh, at will by the owner, right? So this is critical, I think, to both debt and chattel slavery. The master benefits just he has to release the slave after a certain period of time with the debt slave, not so the chattel slave. And again, there are other fine nuances, but that's sort of the general definition that I give.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. And you mentioned before the covenant code. I just wanted to like get these two chair texts, Leviticus 25 and Exodus 21, because I remember even when I was the evangelical, I was like, well, how can people say that the Bible um, condoned or allowed slavery when it says right here in Exodus 21, you can't kidnap,
Yeah,
people against their will. James paraphrase version. So, if you can't man steal or kidnap, therefore there's no slavery because obviously to enslave someone is to kidnap them and hold them against
right.
their will. So can you talk about like those two passages,
Yeah.
Exodus 21 and yeah, Leviticus 25. And
Yeah.
if you,
So
yeah,
this is sort of like the after somebody says in a discussion, well, it's not like the antebellum South. Let's just get that out of the way. Slavery is nothing like the antebellum South. I'm like, okay, I've got my slavery apologetics bingo card is what I'm gonna make,
there
It's
you go.
okay. That's going to be the free square, right? It's not like the antebellum South. But the next thing that they say is, look, I mean, they're either going to say the Imago Dei, Genesis 1:26-27, right? Or they're going to say Exodus 21:16. And the problem with Exodus 21:16 is it sounds super convincing on its face, right? And because when we think of slavery, very often we think of the transatlantic slave trade, and we assume that kidnapping was the
Right.
way that people were enslaved.
Hmm.
The problem is, and I'm not just so everybody understands, I'm not an expert on the antebellum South, but like by like the 19th century, at least the middle of the 19th century, but I think earlier, even I think much earlier, but anyway, certainly by the middle of the 19th century, you're talking about people are born into slavery and have been born into slavery for like 3 generations or something. I mean, it was like, so what I always say in these contexts after, when somebody says to me, hey, access to can't kidnap somebody, it's like, yeah, well, I mean, are you allowed to go steal a car? No. Okay, well, yeah, right. I mean, you can't own a car? Well, no. Yeah, all right. So you can't steal other people's stuff, right? And in this case, that stuff is that person's own freedom, their own status as a free person, as a citizen, as a whatever. You can't steal that from them, right? And so you can't steal other people's slaves, you can't steal free people and reduce them to slavery. That's all illegal. And guess what? It's illegal everywhere. Like we can take you to several different places where in the ancient Near East you have law collections that talk about you can't kidnap people. This is not novel here in the Hebrew Bible. But the other thing to think about is even if it were, right? Even if it were novel, it still doesn't get you where you want to go. Because in 1807 they outlawed kidnapping people, right? Like they add that like you couldn't go and like kidnap people from foreign countries and bring them back under penalty of death, right? You couldn't do that. So Does that mean that slavery stopped in 1807? Obviously not, right? So it's not the flex that they think that it is. And I understand it, right? Because again, on its face, it sounds good. But the problem is that, and this is the other scary thing, because it's so easy to show someone that people were taken captive into slavery in passages like Deuteronomy 21, Numbers 31. What apologists have taken to doing is that, yeah, but it's okay if it's in war.
Yeah,
What?
yeah.
Like, I, it, I mean, can you imagine the scenario today where people were coming back from the war in Iraq and they're like, these military vets are like, running out in their service, their BDUs, like their camouflage stuff. They're running out in the airports and they grab their kids and they put their kid down and they look and there's a rope tied to the arm of the soldier and 6 feet behind him tied around the waist is this woman.
Mm,
And, oh,
yeah,
hey, honey, it's my slave. Oh,
yeah,
well, yeah, I plunder. Yeah,
yeah,
don't worry. It's good. Listen, I know you were having trouble having another kid. Don't worry
uh,
about it. We're
yeah,
good. What? Like
yeah.
I understand, and I think you're right about Cliff to go way back to that.
Oh, right,
I
yeah.
think I think that Cliff does mean well, but he means well in the way that I meant well 15 years
Yes.
ago.
Yeah, yeah.
And the problem is, in a very real sense, that doesn't matter.
Right, yes, that's very fair, and that should be said. Yeah.
And that's not like pushing back on you because I agree with you. But I
Yeah.
think that a lot of apologists will use that as it's kind of a way out. I mean, like
Yeah.
I have friends that I say, and I say this to them, they are the kindest, sweetest bigot you'll ever meet, right? And they are. And so was I. The problem is that somebody like Cliff, we just did a very, very strong response to him um, and Stewart on that Alex O'Connor interview. Kipp and I
Oh, good.
did.
I didn't know that you guys responded to that. I was really,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Okay.
it's in the process of uh, being edited, but I'm trying to
Oh, you
remember.
mentioned that before. Sorry. Yeah, yeah.
Well, we did one on Carmen Imes,
Oh,
uh,
so you
and
did.
and
Okay, sorry, Def.
and no, and we did one on Stewart and Cliff as well. And
Thank
and
God,
the
because sorry, I just wanted to say when Alex released that, I was like, really, Alex? I love you, man, but like, I mean, I'm just a dude that watches him, but I was just like, why, Cliff? Why? But yeah.
and there were certain, I think, concessions that Alex made, and I think he probably did them sort of granting the position, knowing
Mm,
that he was still going to knock it out of the park. But
okay.
yeah, I think that unfortunately we have to be very firm. I don't think we have to be mean, but we have to be very firm
Hmm.
with people like Cliff and Stewart who mean well, but are still being
Misin
recalcitrant.
Yeah, I was about to say, and misinformation is still misinformation,
That's right. That's right.
So yeah,
That's right.
yeah. Like it's I don't know. It's one of those hard interpersonal psychological things because I don't know epistemically what it would take to convince them.
Sure.
Because, frankly, even in that debate that you guys did several years ago, I found that there was sufficient stuff in there. I think maybe they didn't like the way Matt Dillahunty came off to them, and I'm not saying he's a bad guy or anything, but I think they used that maybe as like, or at least more Cliffe, so because Cliffe really got triggered by Matt, who's kind
We're
of the, yeah.
we see this sort of thing a lot. I'm sure you do too. And I'll land here. Um, but we just did a series of responses to Inspiring Philosophy and David Falk. And they've been coming out in sections because there's a lot of material to get through. And unfortunately, what we're seeing more often than not is not not responding to our critiques,
Yeah.
but instead responding to things like Kipp is so rude, right? And
Yeah.
look at this thing that Kipp said wrong about casemate walls, or saying the 13th century instead of the 1300s, right? You know, these are not critical points in the
Yeah.
discussion, and yet they are things that I think allow, and I hate to say it this way, but I think there's a lot of this involved. There's a lot of self-preservation involved here. And
Mm.
I don't knock somebody for their livelihood. I don't knock somebody for like, but I think with somebody like Stuart and Cliffe, like this seems to be a very important facet of their lives. And they've been doing it seemingly for a long time. It seems that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult, I think, to turn the ship when when you're big
Right.
and you've been going down that path at a high rate of speed. So
Yeah. When money and like your identity is tied to it, and yeah, it's like really deep
it's tough.
roots. And
It's tough.
um I was gonna say I think I saw one of those responses to Dr. Falk and
Mm,
uh Inspiring Philosophy.
yeah.
And what was the thing I kept saying? We're playing by Kipp's rules
My
or
kids'
whatever.
rules. That's right.
Um yeah, I was just like, okay, it's kind of petty, but whatever.
Yeah. So, I mean,
But yeah, I one last thing I just want to say and I'll end
yeah.
is just I was really disappointed in the and I know Kipp was too, in the dialogue with Gavin Ortlund and Trent Horn when Kipp was trying to establish common ground about slavery being wrong. And Trent Horn was like, well, in certain circumstances, like in war and prisoners, slavery is okay. And it's like, okay. Or slavery is not intrinsically immoral or intrinsically
Yeah.
evil. And what's ironic about that, though, is that Trent Horn's a Catholic, and Pope John Paul II said slavery was intrinsically evil in,
Oh,
I think
wow.
it's Evangelium Vitae, Gospel of Life. So it's like, it's kind of the Pope, but I'm sure. I mean,
It's kind of the Pope.
it's kind of the Pope there. I don't know, but I'm just a simple boy from North Carolina. I don't know about this. I think you, but and I don't know. Maybe he's got some way around it, but it's just like at
Yeah.
that point, it's like, well, if you can just
Pope's not a
disagree
real
with
Christian, so.
the Pope's not based, okay? So like, but man, but so Dr. Bowen, I really appreciate your time. I
Of
really
course.
really appreciated reading this book. It was inspiring. Got to nerd out. I also read all the legal codes too. So I think I
Nice.
told you.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
some of them, some of them were very repetitive. Some of them were really interesting. And then I was just
Yeah.
like, wow, death penalty, death penalty, death
Yep.
penalty, death
Yep.
penalty. By the way, did I forget death penalty? Um,
Yep.
but But yeah, so everyone, this has been episode 21 with my great returning guest, Dr. Joshua Bowen, on his book, Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? Hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving, and see you guys next time.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.